Democratic republics typically rely on checks and balances to prevent the government from engaging in authoritarianism. And this is the basis of the United States Constitution. We have the House and the Senate, which check one another. We have both of them checked by the presidency. We have all three of those bodies that are checked by the judiciary, and vice versa. Well, one of the checks and balances, traditionally to avoid tyranny, was impeachment. If you didn't like members of the government, or you suspected that members of the government were corrupt, a bipartisan majority would work to oust those corrupt officials. Now, this was obviously problematic because when it comes to getting rid of corrupt officials, if the corrupt official happens to be a member of your party, then you are very unlikely to vote for their impeachment. Now, in the United States, our founding fathers understood this. So, for example, in Federalist number 65, Alexander Hamilton discussed this at length. He wrote, quote, "The subjects of its jurisdiction, meaning the impeachment jurisdiction, are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or, in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. The prosecution of them, for this reason, will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community and to divide it into parties more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. In many cases, it will connect itself with the pre-existing factions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence and interest on one side or on the other. In such cases, says Alexander Hamilton, there will always be the greatest danger the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt. The convention, it appears, thought the Senate the most fit depository of this important trust. Where else than in the Senate could have been found a tribunal sufficiently dignified or sufficiently independent? What other body would be likely to feel confidence enough in its own situation to preserve, unawed and uninfluenced, the necessary impartiality between an individual accused and the representatives of the people, his accuser?" So, this is the argument Alexander Hamilton is making for the fact that there is an impeachment trial that takes place in the United States Senate. Right? Because again, in democratic republics, the question of how you police corruption is a very real question. Let's say you have a corrupt public official. The United States Constitution says that person is impeached in the House, and then there is a full trial in the Senate. Why? Well, Hamilton and the rest of the founding fathers believed the Senate would be the most objective body. Back when the Constitution was designed, United States senators were not appointed by party or by public approval. They were appointed by the state legislatures, and they served 6-year terms. And so the goal was that they would be more independent of sort of the public passions than the House. So you couldn't have the judiciary do it because the judiciary could be hijacked. But Senate was sort of half political, answerable to the public, but also indirectly answerable and thus more insulated from public pressures. So Alexander Hamilton says that this sort of model, in terms of impeachment, was based on the British model. He said, quote, "The model from which the idea of this institution has been borrowed pointed out that course to the convention. In Great Britain, it is the province of the House of Commons to prefer the impeachment and of the House of Lords to decide upon it," which makes, again, some sense. The House of Lords was passed down paternalistically from parents to kids. It was an accepted aristocracy and thus was not pressurable by the public. So Alexander Hamilton pointed out that if you tried to set up a separate impeachment court, which we might now call the DOJ, that wouldn't actually solve the problem because that too could be politicized. So he writes in Federalist 65, quote, "Though this latter supposition may seem harsh and might not be likely often to be verified, it ought not be forgotten that the demon of faction will at certain seasons extend his scepter over all numerous bodies of men." Okay, so again, the original solution for corruption in democratic republics was checks and balances of impeachment, particularly in a body that was going to be somewhat removed from and insulated from public pressure. Well, the problem is that over time, in a wide variety of countries, as democratic republics and their checks and balances have transitioned into administrative bureaucracies in which enormous power is centralized in the executive branch, checks and balances have atrophied. Right? Until Donald Trump was impeached twice, the impeachment power was almost never used by the Congress of the United States, for example. Instead, we made a decision at the outset of the 20th century, this is true in the United States, it's true in other burgeoning democracies as well, that law enforcement, checking corruption, was not to be done by the elected bodies of government. Instead, it was outsourced to so-called independent branches of government. So in the United States, that would be, for example, the Department of Justice. In South Korea, that would be the state prosecutor's office. In Brazil, the prosecutors, the police, the judiciary. In Israel, the attorney general, etc. Now, there is a problem that happens here, and this is a problem with the administrative state. The problem is state prosecutors can also be corrupted by politics, as we have seen in the United States. And then the solution isn't to change the people in government anymore, because these are independent branches, right? They're unelected. It's not a matter of just replacing some people with other people. So if you fire some people, now that's considered interference with the magical objective branch. And if you leave people in place and they target your political opponents, it's weaponization. That's what leads to constitutional crises. And once you have outsourced the job of policing corruption from the elected branches of government, like the Senate of the United States or like the National Assembly in South Korea, to state prosecutors, sooner or later, there will be an attempt either by the state prosecutors to go after the wrong people or by the legislature to go after the state prosecutors or the president to go after the state prosecutors in order to prevent weaponization. This is the problem with setting up fake, quote unquote, objective legal enforcement bodies. It creates constitutional crises because the only solution to a politicized law enforcement branch is to either overthrow the government for, quote, interfering with the system, which is what the president of South Korea is now attempting to do, or to call for the overthrow of the government for weaponizing the system. Right? Constitutional crises are the result of being supposedly untouchable nonpartisan institutions that either can be weaponized or interfered with. And you are seeing this happen across the West. It's a major, major problem. It's the problem with administrative government. It's a major problem with this idea that there are these impartial legal bodies whose job it is to police corruption. And so you are seeing democracies throwing themselves into crisis specifically over this. Let's say that you are in the United States, and let's say that you're really, really angry that Donald Trump became president in 2016. What do? Well, you could try to impeach him. It'll probably fail if you don't have the votes, because it'll break down along strictly partisan lines. So what do you do instead? You rely on the DOJ. You rely on the FBI. You weaponize those institutions against Donald Trump. And that prompts Donald Trump to, if he becomes president again, clean out those institutions, in which case he will be accused of weaponizing those institutions. And so the constitutional crisis just continues to roll on, all because the sort of bipartisan consensus around impeaching presidents who are guilty of crimes has gone away in the United States. You could say it died during the Clinton era, and we are now feeling the after effects of that in the United States. In Israel, it's the same sort of thing. Just take another example, because it's happening in a wide variety of countries. In Israel, the Attorney General's office has put Benjamin Netanyahu under 3 separate prosecutions. All of them appear to be somewhat specious. The goal is obviously political. Netanyahu has been in power for something like 14 out of the last 15 years in Israel. He's a masterful Machiavellian politician, just in pure raw talent terms. And so the Attorney General's office has been weaponized against him, claims Netanyahu, I think largely correctly, in a wide variety of cases. But every time he tries to mess with the prosecution, he is accused of tampering with democracy. Right? Once you set up these institutions as the final arbiter of guilt and innocence, then anyone who tampers with them on either side is now considered a threat to democracy. Even if the person who is actually militarizing law enforcement is the person who is in power. Okay, this is the case in Brazil, for example. So in Brazil, the law enforcement mechanisms have been weaponized by Lula da Silva against Jair Bolsonaro. And that means that while Lula is cleaning out the judiciary institutions, he is being lauded as someone upholding the norms of democracy while he engages in widespread censorship. Again, because instead of corruption being seen as a political issue to be answered by the political branches and eventually the people, because it's been outsourced to law enforcement, what that means is that the law enforcement branch can be routinely corrupted. And that's what's happened in Brazil. You'll recall that it was not all that long ago that Lula da Silva himself had been banned from running because of his own corruption convictions. And then, in 2021, a left-wing Supreme Court judge annulled his corruption convictions and allowed him to run again. And then he ran. And then after he won, you now have the Brazilian police formally accusing former President Bolsonaro and his aides of an alleged 2022 coup attempt. That happened just last week. Police said their sealed findings were being delivered to Brazil's Supreme Court, which will refer them to Prosecutor General Paulo Gonet, who decides either to formally charge Bolsonaro and put him on trial or toss the investigation. Apparently, the report here is 700 pages long. Bolsonaro said he would fight the case and dismiss the investigation as being the result of what he called creativity. Police said in a brief statement the Supreme Court had agreed to reveal the names of all 37 people who were accused to avoid the dissemination of incorrect news. Lula da Silva is openly consolidating power in the executive branch in wildly anti-democratic ways. Lula, of course, has always been fond of left-wing authoritarians. He has been praised by so many members of the media as an anti-authoritarian politician, but the reality is that Lula has been a close ally of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. He has been a close ally of the Cuban regime. In fact, it's rare to find some sort of authoritarian regime that Lula doesn't like. From China to Nicaragua, from Iran to Russia, he is cozied up to authoritarians everywhere. But because he's a left-wing authoritarian, this means he's not really an authoritarian, even if he engages in widespread censorship. Again, this is what happens when democratic republics delegate the power to check political opposition to a supposedly objective, nonpartisan branch of government. It's not real. It doesn't work. Administrative states do not work for precisely this reason, because they're never dispassionate, ever. And again, it's true in a wide variety of countries, from South Korea to Israel to Hungary to Brazil. It's always a problem. Are you tired of the lies and the twists of the mainstream media talking points? Yeah, me too. Join me in my newest series, Fact, where I dismantle and bring truth to this tiring mainstream agenda.